It was the summer of 1983, in Mill Creek, Georgia, when the cicadas sang their endless song, and the air hung thick with humidity and secrets. The small town of barely 800 souls, nestled between rolling hills and the dense canopy of a coney forest, where Spanish moss draped from ancient oaks like forgotten memories. Margaret Maggie Lane had lived in Mill Creek her entire 32 years. Born and raised on Peachtree Lane, she'd never wanted to leave. After graduating from the University of Georgia with a teaching degree, she returned home to work at Mill Creek Elementary, where she taught third grade with the same gentle patience her own teachers had shown her decades before. On that Tuesday evening of July 14th, the temperature still hovered near 90 degrees, even as the sun began its slow descent behind the tree line. Maggie had spent the day preparing her classroom for the upcoming school year, arranging tiny desks and hanging colorful alphabet charts on faded bulletin boards. The school building, a red brick structure built in the 1940s, held the familiar scent of chalk dust and floor wax that had become as comforting to her as Sunday morning coffee. She wore a simple cotton sundress, that day pale yellow with tiny white flowers. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail that caught the light streaming through the classroom windows. Her colleagues would later remember how she hummed while she worked, an old hymn her mother used to sing while hanging laundry on the line. Around 6:30 that evening, Maggie finished organizing her lesson plans for the first week of school. She locked the classroom door, said goodbye to the custodian, and walked to her car in the gravel parking lot. Her 1978 Chevrolet Nova, powder blue with a small dent in the rear bumper from a minor fender bender the previous winter, sat beneath the shade of a large pecan tree. The drive from the school to her small rental house on Maple Street normally took 15 minutes through the center of town. But that night, Maggie had plans to visit her sister Caroline, who lived on the other side of Mill Creek Lake. Caroline had just given birth to her second child, a baby girl named Emma, and Maggie was eager to see her new niece. At exactly 9:15 p.m., Maggie called Caroline from the payphone outside Benson's General Store, the town's only grocery establishment. The store sat at the corner of Main Street and Old Mill Road, its wooden front porch decorated with hand-painted signs advertising Coca-Cola and fresh produce. "I'm running a bit late, Caroline," Maggie said, feeding quarters into the phone as moths danced around the yellow streetlight above. "But I'm heading your way now. I'll take the shortcut through the forest, should be there in 20 minutes. Caroline would replay that conversation in her mind thousands of times over the years that followed. Her sister's voice had sounded normal, perhaps a little tired from the long day, but nothing unusual, nothing that would suggest it would be the last time they would ever speak. "Drive careful, Maggie," Caroline had said. "The road gets dark awful quick once you're in the trees." "I will. Kiss little Emma for me. See you soon." The shortcut Maggie referred to was a narrow dirt road that branched off from Highway 441, about 3 miles south of town. Local folks called it the Old Timber Road, though it hadn't been used for logging in over a decade. The winding path cut directly through the heart of a coney forest, reducing the drive to Caroline's house from 45 minutes to 20. During daylight hours, the road offered glimpses of deer grazing in small clearings and hawks circling overhead. But at night, the dense canopy blocked out most of the moonlight, creating a tunnel of darkness that made even familiar landmarks disappear into shadow. Maggie knew the road well. She'd driven it dozens of times, both as a teenager sneaking out to meet friends at the old swimming hole, and as an adult taking the quick route to Caroline's house. The Nova's headlights were bright, and she kept a flashlight in the glove compartment, just in case. At 9:18 p.m., according to the phone company record, Maggie ended her call with Caroline. She climbed back into the Nova, adjusted the rearview mirror, and turned the radio to WQIK, the local country station that played a mix of Dolly Parton, George Jones, and the newer sounds coming out of Nashville, Mrs. Ruth Hensley, who lived in a small house across from Benson's General Store, later told police she saw Maggie's car pull out of the parking lot and head south on Highway 441. The Nova's tail lights disappeared around the bend near the old Methodist church, and that was the last confirmed sighting of Margaret Lane. The night was warm and still, with only the faintest breeze stirring the leaves. Crickets chirped in the tall grass along the roadside, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley. It seemed like any other summer evening in rural Georgia, the kind of night when time moved slow as molasses, and nothing ever happened. But 20 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. Caroline checked the clock on her kitchen wall, yellow ceramic rooster that had belonged to their grandmother, and felt the first flutter of worry in her chest. Maggie was never late, especially when it came to family. She would call if something had delayed her. By 11 o'clock, Caroline's worry had transformed into genuine fear. She called Maggie's house and let the phone ring 15 times, but there was no answer. She called the school, thinking perhaps Maggie had returned to pick up something she'd forgotten. But the building was dark and empty. Finally, at 11:45 p.m., Caroline called the Mill Creek Sheriff's Department. Deputy Bobby Kellerman answered on the second ring. Sheriff's Office. This is Deputy Kellerman. This is Caroline Whitmore. I need to report. ... Well, I'm not sure exactly. My sister was supposed to come visit me tonight, and she never showed up. That's not like her at all. When was she supposed to arrive, ma'am? Around 9:30. She called me at 9:15 and said she was taking the old timber road. But it's nearly midnight now, and I haven't heard anything. Deputy Kellerman knew both sisters well. In a town the size of Mill Creek, everyone knew everyone, and the Kellerman family had lived there almost as long as the Lanes. He also knew that Maggie was as reliable as the sunrise. I'll take a ride out there and have a look, Mrs. Whitmore. Probably just car trouble, or something simple. You stay by the phone, in case she calls. At 12:30, a meter. On July 15th, Deputy Kellerman drove his patrol car slowly along the old timber road, his spotlight sweeping back and forth across the trees. The beam illuminated patches of kudzu, fallen logs, and the occasional pair of animal eyes reflecting back from the darkness. About 2 miles into the forest, where the road curved sharply to the left, around a massive oak tree, Kellerman spotted something that made his stomach drop. There, pulled off to the side of the road, with its front end pointing toward a break in the trees, sat a powder blue Chevrolet Nova. The driver's side door hung open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The engine was off, but the radio still played softly Patsy Cline's voice, drifting through the humid air, singing, "Crazy." The headlights were dark, but the interior dome light glowed weakly, casting strange shadows across the empty seats. Deputy Kellerman approached the vehicle with his hand resting on his service weapon, though he couldn't have said exactly why. The car appeared abandoned, but something about the scene felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. Maggie's purse sat on the passenger seat, undisturbed. Her keys dangled from the ignition. A half-empty bottle of Coca-Cola stood in the cup holder, still cold to the touch. On the dashboard, a small spiral notebook lay open to a page where she'd written grocery items in her neat handwriting. Milk, bread, tomatoes, laundry soap. Everything suggested she had simply stepped out of the car for a moment, perhaps to check a tire, or move a fallen branch from the road. But there was no sign of Maggie anywhere. Kellerman called out her name several times, his voice echoing through the trees. Maggie, Maggie Lane. Can you hear me? But the forest offered no response except the endless chorus of insects and the distant hoot of an owl. As he walked around the vehicle, Kellerman's flashlight beam caught something unusual. The ground around the car had been disturbed, but not in the way he would expect from someone simply getting out and walking around. The earth appeared to have been deliberately smoothed, as if someone had used a branch or rake to erase footprints. It was then that he noticed the radio. Despite the car being turned off for what must have been hours, the music continued to play, though the volume seemed to fade in and out, like a signal struggling to reach its destination. The song changed to something he didn't recognize, melancholy tune that seemed to drift through the trees like mist. Deputy Kellerman secured the scene and radioed for backup. Within an hour, Sheriff Alan Pickett arrived along with 2 additional deputies and the volunteer fire department's search and rescue team. By dawn, more than 30 people had gathered at the edge of a coney forest, ready to begin looking for Margaret Lane. But as the sun rose over the Georgia pines and the morning light filtered through the canopy, one thing became clear. Whatever had happened to Maggie Lane on that warm July night, the forest wasn't ready to give up its secrets easily. The Nova sat silent now, its radio finally quiet, while somewhere deeper in the woods, answers waited in the shadows like buried treasure that might never be found. The search for Margaret Lane began at first light on July 15, 1983, when the Georgia sun cut through the morning mist like a blade through gauze. Sheriff Alan Pickett stood beside Maggie's abandoned Nova, watching as volunteers emerged from pickup trucks and station wagons, their faces grim with determination and worry. Pickett was a tall, lean man in his early 50s, who had served as Mill Creek's sheriff for nearly 2 decades. He'd seen his share of missing persons cases over the years, mostly teenagers who'd run off to Atlanta or Savannah seeking bigger dreams than small-town Georgia could offer. But this felt different. Maggie Lane wasn't the type to disappear without a word, and the scene around her car troubled him in ways he couldn't yet put into words. The volunteer search team included farmers, shop owners, retired military veterans, and high school students home for summer break. Clara Vaughan, who ran the local diner, arrived carrying thermoses of coffee and a box of homemade biscuits. Her husband Frank brought his tracking dogs to bloodhounds named Duke and Dixie, who had helped locate lost hunters and wandering elderly folks on previous occasions. Caroline Whitmore stood at the edge of the search area, holding her newborn daughter Emma against her chest. Her face was pale and drawn, and she'd barely slept since Deputy Kellerman's call in the middle of the night. She kept staring at her sister's car, as if she could will Maggie to materialize from the forest's shadows. "We're going to find her," Sheriff Pickett assured Caroline, though his voice carried more hope than confidence. "Probably just got turned around in the dark." These woods can be confusing, even for folks who know them well. The search teams divided into groups of 4, each equipped with walkie-talkies, first aid kits, and whistles. They would work in a grid pattern, starting from the car and moving outward in expanding circles. The forest was dense with undergrowth, thick tangles of blackberry bushes, patches of poison ivy, and fallen logs covered in moss that had been decomposing for decades. Frank Vaughan released his bloodhounds near the Nova's open door, hoping they could pick up Maggie's scent. The dogs sniffed around the vehicle for several minutes, their tails wagging as they caught familiar odors. Then Duke suddenly lifted his head and began moving toward the tree line, followed closely by Dixie. The dogs led the searchers about 50 yards into the forest before stopping at a large pine tree. Dixie began whining and pawing at the ground, while Duke circled the tree's base, clearly agitated. When the searchers examined the area more closely, they found something that made everyone's blood run cold. Caught on a low branch, about 4 feet from the ground, was a small gold earring. Caroline immediately recognized it as one of the pair their mother had given Maggie for her college graduation. The earring's clasp was broken, as if it had been torn away suddenly. "She was here," Caroline whispered, reaching out to touch the delicate piece of jewelry. "She made it this far, but that was where the trail ended." Despite the bloodhounds' best efforts, they couldn't pick up any scent beyond the pine tree. It was as if Maggie had simply vanished into thin air at that spot, leaving behind only the broken earring as evidence she'd ever been there at all. As the day wore on, the search expanded to cover nearly 2 square miles of forest. Volunteers called out Maggie's name until their voices grew hoarse, their calls echoing through the trees like prayers with no answer. They found plenty of wildlife-startled deer, a family of raccoons, and one timber rattlesnake that sent everyone scrambling backward, but no trace of the missing squatteacher. By afternoon, the Georgia heat had become oppressive. The temperature climbed past 95 degrees, and the humidity made the air feel thick enough to cut with a knife. Several volunteers had to take breaks in the shade, and 2 elderly men were sent home after showing signs of heat exhaustion. It was around 3 o'clock when young Tommy Patterson, a 17-year-old whose family owned the hardware store, made another disturbing discovery. Deep in a section of forest that hadn't been logged in over 20 years, he found a torn piece of paper wedged between 2 rocks near a dry creek bed. The paper turned out to be part of a topographical map of a coney forest, the kind sold at gas stations and outdoor supply stores. What made it significant was the red ink marker large X, drawn over an area about a mile deeper into the woods than where the earring had been found. Sheriff Pickett studied the map fragment with growing unease. The X marked a location he knew well, an old homestead that had been abandoned since the 1940s. Local legends claimed the property was cursed, though Pickett had always dismissed such talk as small-town superstition. "Could be nothing," he told his deputy, though his instincts suggested otherwise. "But we'd better check it out." The trek to the marked location took nearly an hour, through increasingly difficult terrain. Ancient trees blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that made the forest feel like a cathedral built for forgotten gods. The air grew cooler as they moved deeper into the woods, and an estranged silence settled over the search party. When they finally reached the coordinates marked on the map, they found the ruins of what had once been a small farmhouse. Only the stone foundation remained, along with part of a collapsed chimney and the rusted skeleton of an old truck that had been claimed by decades of Georgia weather. But there was no sign of Maggie Lane. As darkness began to fall on that first day, Sheriff Pickett made the difficult decision to call off the search until morning. The forest became treacherous after sunset, and he couldn't risk losing any volunteers to the same mysterious fate that might have claimed Maggie. The search resumed the next day, and the day after that. Word spread throughout the region, and volunteers came from neighboring counties to help. The Georgia State Patrol sent additional officers, and a helicopter from the National Guard conducted aerial surveys of the forest canopy. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade like morning dew under the relentless summer sun. The bloodhounds lost interest, the helicopters found nothing, and the volunteers gradually returned to their normal lives. By the end of July, only a handful of dedicated searchers continued to comb through the woods on weekends. Caroline Whitmore refused to give up. Every Saturday and Sunday, she would drive to the forest with baby Emma strapped to her chest in a carrier, walking the same trails and calling her sister's name. Other family members tried to convince her to stop, worried about her mental health and the safety of bringing an infant into the wilderness. "She's out there somewhere," Caroline would insist, her voice growing more desperate with each passing week. "She's waiting for us to find her." The local newspaper, the Mill Creek Gazette, ran weekly updates on the search efforts throughout August and September. But as autumn arrived, and the leaves began to change, even the most optimistic residents started to accept that Maggie Lane might never come home. Sheriff Pickett continued to investigate other possibilities. He interviewed everyone who had seen Maggie on the day she disappeared, checked with hospitals throughout Georgia and neighboring states, and contacted the FBI about potential kidnapping scenarios. But every lead turned into a dead end. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. Strange stories began to circulate through the community. Clara Vaughan swore she had seen 2 sets of headlights leaving town that night, one belonging to Maggie's Nova, the other to a dark pickup truck with no license plates. But when pressed for details, her memory became fuzzy, and no other witnesses could corroborate her account. An old hunter named Levi Barrett claimed he had heard a woman calling for help deep in the forest around 10 o'clock that night, but the sound had stopped so suddenly that he convinced himself it must have been a screech owl or some other nocturnal creature. He didn't report it to authorities until weeks later, when guilt finally overcame his uncertainty. Most disturbing of all was the testimony of Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, an elderly widow who lived alone in a cottage near the edge of the forest. She insisted that she had seen lights moving through the trees for several nights after Maggie's disappearance. Not flashlights or lanterns, but something else entirely. They moved wrong, she told anyone who would listen, like they were floating instead of walking. The authorities dismissed most of these accounts as small-town folklore and overactive imaginations, but the stories persisted, growing more elaborate with each telling, until the disappearance of Margaret Lane became woven into the fabric of Mill Creek's collective memory. As 1983 drew to a close, the official search was suspended indefinitely. Maggie's car was released to her family, who couldn't bear to keep it, and sold it to a dealer in Atlanta. Her personal belongings were boxed up and stored in Caroline's attic, waiting for a day that might never come. The case file remained open, but it was moved to the back of Sheriff Pickett's filing cabinet, behind more recent crimes that demanded immediate attention. Sometimes, late at night in his office, Pickett would pull out the folder and spread the photographs and reports across his desk, searching for clues he might have missed. The broken earring was kept in an evidence envelope, along with the torn map and soil samples from around the abandoned car. But evidence without context was just a collection of meaningless objects, and context seemed to have vanished into the Georgia woods, along with Margaret Lane herself. Years passed. Sheriff Pickett retired in 1987 and was replaced by his deputy, Bobby Kellerman, who had been first on the scene that terrible night. The case file was transferred to a new filing cabinet, then to storage boxes in the courthouse basement, as newer mysteries took precedence. Caroline Whitmore aged visibly over those years, her auburn hair turning grey at the temples and lines of worry, etching themselves permanently around her eyes. She never stopped hoping, but she stopped searching. The forest had kept its secret too well, and she had a daughter to raise and a life to rebuild. The town of Mill Creek slowly forgot about Margaret Lane, or at least learned to live with the unanswered questions. New teachers were hired at the elementary school, new families moved into the area, and the younger generation grew up without ever knowing there had once been a schoolteacher who vanished into the woods on a warm July night. But the forest remembered. On certain evening, when the wind was just right and the shadows fell at particular angles. Some folks claimed they could still hear echoes in the trees, the sound of a woman's voice calling out for help that would never come. And somewhere deep in the heart of a coney forest, where time moved differently and secrets grew like moss on forgotten stones, the truth about Margaret Lane waited patiently for someone brave enough to dig it out of the darkness. 35 years had passed when the drought of 2018 came to Georgia, like an unwelcome reminder of forgotten sins. Mill Creek Lake, which had provided the town with recreation and a sense of peace for over a century, began to shrink week by week as the relentless summer sun evaporated what little rain had fallen that spring. By late August, the lake had receded nearly 50 feet from its normal shoreline, revealing secrets that had been hidden beneath the dark water for decades. Old boat docks stood like skeletal fingers, reaching toward water that was no longer there. Rusted car parts, lost fishing equipment, and the concrete foundations of buildings that had been flooded when the lake was created in the 1920s emerged from the mud like archaeological treasures from a lost civilization. It was on a Tuesday morning, August 28th, when 16-year-old Jessica Chen made the discovery that would resurrect the ghost of Margaret Lane. Jessica had been walking along the newly exposed lakebed with her metal detector, a hobby she'd picked up from her grandfather, searching for coins and jewelry that might have been lost by swimmers and boaters over the years. The morning air was already thick with humidity despite the early hour, and the exposed mud gave off a rich, earthy smell that reminded her of her grandmother's garden after a heavy rain. Near what would have been the lake's original shoreline, before the dam was built, Jessica's metal detector began chirping insistently. She knelt in the dried mud and began digging with a small garden trowel, expecting to find another beer can or piece of fishing tackle. Instead, her fingers closed around something metallic and cylindrical. As she worked it free from the hard-packed earth, she realized she was holding an old mailbox post, the kind that had been common in rural areas decades ago. The metal was heavily rusted, and moss and algae still clung to its surface, but the words Lane family were still visible, carved into a wooden nameplate that had somehow survived its long submersion. Jessica's heart began to race. Even at 16, she knew the story of Margaret Lane. It was one of those local legends that got passed down through generations, whispered around campfires, and told to frighten children into staying close to home after dark. But this mailbox suggested that the Lane family had once lived near the lake, in an area that had been flooded when the dam was constructed. With growing excitement, Jessica carefully extracted the entire mailbox assembly from the mud. As she lifted it, something rattled inside the metal container. The mailbox door, swollen with age and corrosion, finally gave way when she applied gentle pressure with her trowel. Inside was a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be several layers of plastic bags, the heavy-duty kind used for storing documents or protecting valuable items from moisture. Despite decades underwater, the contents seemed to have remained relatively dry. Jessica's hands trembled as she carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, printed on the thick paper that had been common in the 1980s. Most were faded and water-damaged, but several remained clear enough to make out distinct images. The photographs showed the forest at dusk, with long shadows stretching between the trees and shafts of golden sunlight filtering through the canopy. They appeared to have been taken from inside a vehicle, as the edge of a car window was visible in several shots. At first glance, they seemed like innocent nature photography, the kind of pictures someone might take during a scenic drive through the woods. But as Jessica examined them more closely, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the corner of one photograph, barely visible in the reflection on the car window, was the image of a woman with auburn hair. The reflection was distorted and difficult to make out, but the woman appeared to be looking over her shoulder with an expression of fear or surprise on her face. Another photograph showed what looked like headlights in the distance, partially obscured by trees. The lights seemed to be following the same path through the forest, suggesting that the photographer had not been alone on that dark road. Most disturbing of all was a photograph that appeared to have been taken from outside the vehicle. It showed a powder blue Corran masticably, a Chevrolet Nova parked beside the road, with its driver's door hanging open. The interior light was on, casting an eerie glow in the gathering darkness. Jessica stared at the photographs with growing comprehension and horror. These weren't random pictures taken by some nature enthusiast. They were evidence documentation of Margaret Lane's final moments, captured by someone who had been there when she disappeared. On the back of several photographs, someone had written dates and times in fading blue ink. The clearest marking read, July 14, 1983, 9:45 p.m. Jessica ran home as fast as her legs could carry her, clutching the bundle of photographs against her chest. Her grandfather, Robert Chen, was a retired police detective who had moved to Mill Creek 5 years earlier to enjoy his golden years in quiet obscurity. When Jessica burst through his front door, gasping and trying to explain her discovery, he immediately recognized the significance of what she had found. "We need to call the sheriff's department right now," he told her, already reaching for his phone. "Don't touch the photographs anymore. This is evidence in a criminal case." Sheriff David Morrison had been in charge of the Mill Creek Sheriff's Department for only 3 years, having taken over when Bobby Kellerman retired. He was familiar with the Margaret Lane case only through the old files and the stories that older residents still told. But he understood immediately that Jessica's discovery could be the break investigator had been waiting for since 1983. The photographs were sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Forensic Laboratory in Atlanta, where experts used advanced digital enhancement techniques to extract every possible detail from the faded images. What they found confirmed everyone's worst fears and opened new questions that were even more disturbing than the original mystery. The enhanced images clearly showed Margaret Lane in the car's reflection. Computer analysis confirmed that the vehicle in the photographs was indeed her Chevrolet Nova, and the time stamp corresponded exactly with when she had disappeared. But the photographs also revealed details that had been invisible to the naked eye. In one enhanced image, the headlights following the Nova appeared to belong to a pickup trucker, detail that corroborated Clara Vaughan's long-dismissed testimony about seeing 2 vehicles leave town that night. The truck's license plate was too obscured to read, but forensic experts determined it was likely a Ford or Chevrolet model from the late 1970s or early 90s. More chilling was the discovery that some of the photographs had been taken from multiple locations along the old timber road. This suggested that whoever had been documenting Margaret's journey had either followed her for an extended period or had been waiting at predetermined spots along her route. The implications were terrifying. Margaret Lane hadn't simply gotten lost in the woods or fallen victim to some random accident. She had been stalked, followed, and photographed by someone who had planned her disappearance in advance. But the most disturbing revelation came when forensic experts analyzed the metadata and chemical composition of the photographic paper. The pictures had definitely been taken in 1983, but they showed signs of having been developed much later, possibly months or even years after Margaret's disappearance. This meant that whoever had taken the photographs had kept them as some kind of trophy, developing them at their leisure and eventually hiding them in the waterproof container for reasons known only to themselves. The discovery of the photographs sent shockwaves through Mill Creek and the surrounding communities. The local newspaper ran a front-page story that was picked up by regional television stations and eventually national media outlets. For the first time in decades, Margaret Lane's name was in headlines across the country. Caroline Whitmore, now 53 years old and a grandmother herself, was contacted by reporters and investigators seeking her reaction to the new evidence. She had never given up hope that someday she would learn the truth about her sister's fate, but she had never imagined it would come in such a horrifying form. "All these years, I thought maybe she had gotten lost, or had an accident, or even that she might have chosen to disappear for reasons I couldn't understand," Caroline told Sheriff Morrison during a tearful But to know that someone was watching her, following her, taking pictures, it makes everything so much worse. The photographs were also shown to some of the original witnesses from 1983, including Clara Vaughan, who was now in her 80s, but still sharp as a tack. When she saw the enhanced image of the pickup truck's headlights, her face went pale. "That's them," she whispered, pointing at the photograph with a trembling finger. "Those are the lights I saw that night. I knew I wasn't imagining things." Levi Barrett, the hunter who had reported hearing a woman's cries for help, had passed away in 2009, but his son confirmed that his father had described seeing headlights moving through the forest at approximately the same time and location shown in the photographs. The discovery prompted authorities to reopen the Margaret Lane case officially. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation assigned to senior detectives to review all the original evidence and conduct new interviews with anyone who might have information about the case. But even with this stunning new evidence, Fundamental questions remained unanswered. Who had taken the photographs? Why had they been hidden in the old mailbox? And most importantly, what had happened to Margaret Lane after those final images were captured? The photographs showed her alive and apparently unharmed as of 9:45 p.m. on July 14, 1983. But that was where the visual record ended, and the darkness of a Coney forest had swallowed the rest of her story. As news of the discovery spread, longtime residents of Mill Creek found themselves revisiting memories they had tried to forget. Some remembered details they had previously dismissed as unimportant: a suspicious vehicle seen in the area around that time, unusual activity in the forest, or conversations overheard in local establishments. The photographs had given Margaret Lane a voice again after 35 years of silence, but that voice was crying out from the past, asking questions that the living still didn't know how to answer. In the enhanced reflection of her car window, Margaret's face seemed to be looking directly at the camera, her eyes wide with what appeared to be recognition or fear. It was as if she had seen her stalker and understood, in that terrible moment, that she was in grave danger. The image would haunt everyone who saw it, a frozen moment of terror that had waited decades in the darkness before finally surfacing, to demand justice for a woman who had vanished into the Georgia woods on a warm summer night when the world still believed that some mysteries would never be solved. The break in the Margaret Lane case came from an unexpected Saucer hospital room in Augusta, Georgia, where an 82-year-old man lay dying of emphysema in October 2018. Harold Hank Morrison had lived in Mill Creek most of his life, working as a mechanic at Benson's Auto Repair, until his retirement in 1995. He was known as a quiet man who kept to himself, lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, and had never married. Most people who knew him would have described him as harmless, but certainly not dangerous. But as Hank lay in his hospital bed, struggling to breathe through damaged lungs, ravaged by decades of cigarettes and automotive fumes, the weight of a 35-year-old secret had become unbearable. The photographs discovered at Mill Creek Lake had been shown on every local news station and featured in newspaper articles throughout Georgia. When Hank saw the enhanced images of the pickup truck following Margaret Lane's Nova, he knew his time was running out, both literally and figuratively. On October 15th, Hank asked his nurse to contact the sheriff's department. He had something to confess. He said, something about the schoolteacher who had disappeared all those years ago. Sheriff Morrison, who, ironically, shared the same last name as the dying man, but was no relation, arrived at the hospital within an hour, accompanied by Detective Sarah Kim from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. They found Hank propped up in his bed, an oxygen mask covering most of his gaunt face, and machines monitoring his failing vital signs. "I don't have much time left," Hank wheezed when the officers entered his room. "And I can't take this secret with me to the grave. It's been eating at me for 35 years. Detective Kim activated her digital recorder and read Hank his rights, though he waved away any concern about legal consequences. What could they do to him now? He was already dying. "Tell us about Margaret Lane," Sheriff Morrison said gently. "Tell us what you know." Hank's confession came in broken sentences, interrupted by coughing fits and long pauses as he struggled to find enough breath to continue. But slowly, piece by piece, the truth about that July night in 1983 began to emerge. "I had a problem back then," Hank began, his voice barely audible above the hiss of the oxygen machine. "I couldn't help myself. I liked to watch people, to follow them, especially women who were alone." He paused to take several labored breaths before continuing. "I knew Margaret's routine. She visited her sister every few weeks, sometimes took that shortcut through the forest. I had followed her before, just to see where she went, how she drove. I never meant to hurt anybody." Detective Kim leaned forward in her chair. "You were the one in the pickup truck that night." Hank nodded weakly. "My old Ford. I'd been waiting near the general store, saw her make that phone call. When she headed towards the forest road, I followed her like I had done before. But that night was different. Different how? She knew I was there. Maybe she'd seen me following her on other occasions. Or maybe she just got scared when she realized the same headlights had been behind her for too long. When we got deep into the forest, she started driving faster, trying to get away from me." Hank's breathing became more labored as he relived that night. The machines around his bed began beeping more rapidly, but he waved away the nurse who tried to check on him. "She lost control on one of those curves," he continued. "Hit a tree, but not hard. The car wasn't badly damaged, and she wasn't hurt. But when she got out to check the damage, she saw me pulling up behind her. The look on her face, ... She was terrified. What happened then, Hank? Sheriff Morrison asked. She started running into the woods. I got out of my truck and went after her, but I wasn't trying to hurt her. I just wanted to explain, to tell her I was sorry for scaring her. But she kept running deeper into the forest, calling for help. The confession matched Levi Barrett's old testimony about hearing a woman's cries in the woods that night. Detective Kim made a note to review that part of the original case file. I followed her for maybe half a mile before I lost sight of her in the darkness. Hank continued. I called out, told her I wasn't going to hurt her, but she wouldn't answer. Eventually, I gave up and went back to the road, and the photographs. Detective Kim asked, why did you take pictures? Hank's face contorted with shame. I had a camera in my truck, an old Polaroid I used for documenting car repairs at the shop. When I saw her car sitting there empty, with the door open and the radio still playing, I don't know what came over me. I started taking pictures. He paused for a long moment, lost in the memory. It was like I wanted to remember that moment, to have proof of what had happened. I took pictures of the car, of the road, of the forest where she had disappeared. I even took some while I was following her earlier, before she crashed. But you didn't develop them right away. No, I was too scared. I kept the film hidden in my house for months, afraid that if I took it to the photo shop, someone would see what was on it and ask questions. I finally developed them myself, in 1984. Using a darkroom I set up in my basement. Detective Kim felt a chill run down her spine. What did you do with Margaret after she ran into the woods? Nothing, Hank said emphatically, his voice growing stronger with desperation. I swear to you, I never found her after she ran away. I searched for maybe an hour, but the forest was too dark and too thick. Eventually, I got scared and decided to leave. But you moved her car. Hank nodded weakly. I was panicking. I knew if the car was found where she crashed, investigators might figure out that she'd been followed. So I drove it back to where you eventually found it, made it look like she had just pulled over and walked into the woods for some reason. You staged the scene. I wiped down the area around the car, tried to make it look undisturbed. I even smoothed out the tire tracks where she had skidded off the road. Then I took my truck and went home, hoping that somehow she would find her way out of the forest on her own. Sheriff Morrison studied the dying man's face, looking for signs of deception. But she never came out of those woods. Hank, what do you think happened to her? Hank's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion he had shown during the confession. I don't know. I've thought about it every day for 35 years. Maybe she got lost and couldn't find her way back to the road. Maybe she fell into a ravine or got bitten by a snake. Maybe she just kept running until she collapsed from exhaustion. Or maybe, Detective Kim said quietly, someone else found her in those woods. The implication hung in the hospital room like a dark cloud. If Hank's story was true, then Margaret Lane had survived the initial incident but had disappeared somewhere deeper in a coney forest. The question was whether she had died from natural causes, exposure, injury, or animal attacker, whether someone else had encountered her during her desperate flight through the darkness. Why did you hide the photographs in the mailbox? Sheriff Morrison asked. That mailbox belonged to Margaret's grandparents, Hank explained. Their old homestead was down by the lake before it was flooded to create the reservoir. I thought it was fitting somehow, keeping the pictures in something that belonged to her family. And I knew that as long as the lake was there, nobody would ever find them. But you kept them for 15 years. First, Hank's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I looked at them sometimes. When I was feeling guilty about what had happened, I would take them out and stare at them, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. In some of the pictures, you can see her face reflected in the car window. She looked so scared. As Hank's confession continued, a fuller picture of that night began to emerge. He had been stalking Margaret for months, following her on her evening drives and learning her routines. His behavior had escalated from simple voyeurism to active pursuit, and on July 14, 1983, his obsession had finally led to tragedy. But Hank insisted he had never intended to harm Margaret, and Detective Kim found herself believing him. His story explained many of the puzzling aspects of the case: the staged scene around the car, the lack of evidence beyond the broken earring, and the mysterious photographs that had documented Margaret's final moments. Did anyone else know what you had done? Detective Kim asked. Nobody. I never told a soul until today. I couldn't live with the secret anymore. But I was too much of a coward to come forward, while I still had a life to lose. Hank died 3 days later, taking with him any additional details about that terrible night. His confession had answered some questions, but had raised others that might never be resolved. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation launched a new search of Oconee Forest, this time focusing on the area where Hank claimed Margaret had fled into the woods. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they hoped to finally locate her remains and give the Lane family the closure they had sought for over 3 decades. But the forest kept its secrets well. Despite weeks of intensive searching, no trace of Margaret Lane was found. If she had died in those woods 35 years ago, nature had long since reclaimed whatever evidence might have existed. Caroline Whitmore was devastated by Hank's confession. Learning that her sister had been stalked and terrorized during her final hours was almost worse than not knowing what had happened at all. But she also felt a strange sense of relief that the mystery had finally been solved. Even if Margaret's body might never be recovered, at least now I know she didn't suffer for very long, Caroline told reporters outside the courthouse after Hank's confession was made public. She was scared, but she fought back. She tried to escape. That sounds like the Maggie I knew, brave and determined until the very end. The revelation that Margaret Lane had been the victim of a stalker rather than random misfortune sent shockwaves through Mill Creek and the surrounding community. Residents who had known Hank Morrison for decades struggled to reconcile the quiet mechanic they remembered with the disturbed individual described in his confession. Some people felt guilty that they hadn't recognized the signs of his obsessive behavior earlier. Others wondered how many other women might have been followed or watched without ever realizing they were in danger. The case served as a sobering reminder that evil could hide behind the most ordinary faces, even in small towns where everyone thought they knew everyone else. The photographs that had broken the case open were sealed as evidence, but their existence continued to haunt everyone who had seen them. The image of Margaret Lane's terrified face reflected in her car window became a symbol of all the victims whose cries for help had gone unheard, whose disappearances had been dismissed as accidents or voluntary departures. In the end, Hank Morrison's confession had provided answers but not resolution. Margaret Lane was still missing, still lost somewhere in the vast expanse of Oconee Forest. Her family finally knew how she had died, but they still didn't know where. The case officially remained open, classified as a homicide, despite the lack of direct evidence that Hank had killed Margaret. The consensus among investigators was that his actions stalking her, pursuing her into the forest, and then covering up the incident, had directly led to her death, even if he hadn't struck the fatal blow himself. But in the deep shadows of the Georgia woods, where sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and time seemed to move differently than in the outside world, Margaret Lane's final resting place remained a mystery that perhaps only the trees would ever know. 5 years have passed since Hank Morrison's deathbed confession shattered the decades-long mystery surrounding Margaret Lane's disappearance. It is now 2023, and the case has taken on a life of its own, becoming part of the cultural fabric of Mill Creek and a touchstone for discussions about women's safety, small-town secrets, and the long shadows that unsolved crimes cast over entire community. The Mill Creek Elementary School, where Margaret once taught 3rd grade with such dedication and warmth, now bears a small memorial plaque near the front entrance. It reads simply, "In memory of Margaret Maggie Lane, beloved teacher, 1951 to 1983. Her spirit of learning and kindness lives on in every child she taught." The plaque was installed after former students, now adults with children of their own, raised funds to honor the teacher who had shaped their early years. Caroline Whitmore, now 58, has become an advocate for victims, families, and missing persons cases throughout Georgia. She speaks at law enforcement conferences and victim support groups, sharing her experience of living with uncertainty for 35 years and the complex emotions that came with finally learning the truth. Her daughter Emma, the baby who was only weeks old when her aunt disappeared, is now a social worker specializing in trauma counseling. The hardest part wasn't not knowing. Caroline often tells audiences, "It was learning that someone had watched my sister's final moments of terror and kept those images as trophies for 35 years. But there's also something to be said for finally having answers. Even when those answers are painful, the case has attracted attention from true crime podcasters, documentary filmmakers, and investigative journalists from across the country. Mill Creek, a town that had largely remained hidden from the outside world, found itself thrust into the national spotlight as media outlets explored the story of Margaret Lane and the quiet mechanic who had harbored such a dark secret for most of his adult life. Jessica Chen, now 21 and studying criminal justice at the University of Georgia, credits her discovery of the photographs with shaping her career path. She plans to work for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation after graduation, specializing in cold cases and forensic analysis. The metal detector that led her to the hidden mailbox sits in a place of honor in her childhood bedroom, a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries come from unexpected places. I think about Margaret Lane almost every day, Jessica says. How different things might have been if she had taken the main road that night, or if someone had noticed Hank Morrison's behavior earlier. It makes me want to be the kind of investigator who never gives up, no matter how cold a case gets. The Oconee Forest itself has been partially cleared and developed in the years since the confession. A new housing subdivision called Lanes Ridge now occupies part of the area where Margaret disappeared, though the developers chose the name to honor her memory, rather than exploit the notoriety of the case. The old timber road where her car was found has been paved and incorporated into the subdivision's main thoroughfare. Some residents opposed the development, feeling that the forest should remain untouched as an informal memorial to Margaret. But others argued that bringing light and life to the area was preferable to leaving it as a place associated only with tragedy and fear. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a forensic anthropologist who assisted with the renewed search efforts, believes that Margaret's remains may never be found. After 40 years in a Georgia forest, exposed to the elements, animal activity, and natural decomposition, there might not be anything left to discover, she explains. The forest has a way of reclaiming everything given enough time. Yet the search continues on a smaller scale. Every few months, volunteer groups organized by Caroline and other family members conduct methodical searches of remaining undeveloped areas in and around Oconee Forest. They use updated technology, including drones with thermal imaging and more sophisticated ground-penetrating radar. But the results have been consistently disappointing. Sheriff David Morrison, who has now been in charge of the Mill Creek Sheriff's Department for 8 years, keeps Margaret's case file on his desk rather than in storage. It's a reminder, he says, that every missing person represents a family in agony, a community with questions, and a responsibility that doesn't end just because time passes. The psychological impact of the case extends far beyond Margaret's immediate family. Dr. Susan Walsh, a criminologist who has studied the effect of unsolved crimes on small communities, spent 2 years in Mill Creek researching how the disappearance shaped the town's collective psyche. What we see in Mill Creek is a community that learned to live with uncertainty, but also one that developed a heightened awareness of danger. Dr. Walsh explains in her published study, parents became more protective, women more cautious about traveling alone, and neighbors more watchful of each other's activity. In some ways, Hank Morrison's secret changed the entire character of the town. Even though no one knew he was the cause, the case has also influenced law enforcement protocols throughout Georgia. The delay in recognizing Margaret's disappearance as a potential crime rather than a simple missing person case highlighted the need for more immediate and thorough investigation procedures. Today, when someone disappears under suspicious circumstances, the response is swifter and more comprehensive. Detective Sarah Kim, who took Hank Morrison's confession, has become a specialist in cold case investigations and frequently consults on similar cases throughout the Southeast. She credits the Margaret Lane case with teaching her the importance of preserving evidence indefinitely and never assuming that old cases are truly closed. We learned that sometimes the most important break in a case comes not from new evidence, but from old evidence viewed through new eyes. Detective Kim explains, those photographs had been sitting at the bottom of Mill Creek Lake for decades, waiting for the right conditions to surface. It makes you wonder what other secrets are out there, waiting to be discovered. The revelation of Hank Morrison's stalking behavior also prompted a broader examination of how such warning signs are recognized and addressed. Mental health professionals in the area began offering more resources for identifying and treating obsessive behavior before they escalate to dangerous levels. Clara Vaughn, now 88, and one of the last surviving witnesses from the original investigation, still runs her diner on Main Street. The walls are covered with newspaper clippings about the case, photographs of the search efforts, and letters from people around the country who have been touched by Margaret's story. I always knew I had seen 2 sets of headlights that night, Clara says with satisfaction. For 35 years, people thought I was just an old woman with a confused memory. But I knew what I saw, and I never stopped believing that Margaret deserved justice. The impact of the case on Mill Creek's younger generation has been profound. High school students study Margaret's disappearance in social studies classes, learning about the importance of community vigilance and the long-term effects of violent crime. The local library has created an archive of materials related to the case, including police reports, newspaper clippings, and oral histories from community members who lived through the original investigation. Emma Whitmore, Caroline's daughter, has mixed feelings about growing up in the shadow of her aunt's disappearance. It's strange to be known as the niece of that missing teacher, she reflects. But it's also given me a sense of purpose. I work with trauma victims every day, and I understand in a very personal way how violence ripples through families and communities for generations. The old timber road, where Margaret's car was found, has been renamed Margaret Lane in her honor. A small roadside marker tells the story of her disappearance and encourages travelers to report any suspicious activity to local authorities. The marker has become an unofficial pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts and others moved by Margaret's story. Forensic technology continues to advance, and investigators remain hopeful that future developments might provide new insights into the case. Soil samples collected from various locations in the forest have been preserved, in case new analytical techniques become available. DNA analysis has improved dramatically since 1983, and any biological evidence that might be discovered in the future would be processed with capabilities that were unimaginable when Margaret first disappeared. The psychological profile of Hank Morrison, compiled after his death from interviews with people who knew him and analysis of his confession, has been used to train law enforcement officers in recognizing potential stalkers and obsessive individuals. His case demonstrates how dangerous behavior can hide behind a facade of normalcy for decades. Caroline Whitmore has written a memoir about her experience, titled Waiting for Maggie, a sister's journey through loss and hope. The book has become a resource for other families dealing with missing persons cases, offering both practical advice and emotional support for those facing similar ordeals. I learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting, Caroline writes in the book's conclusion. It means finding a way to carry the love and the loss together, to honor the memory of the person you've lost, while still building a meaningful life for yourself and your family. The annual Margaret Lane Memorial Walk, held every July 14th, draws participants from throughout Georgia and neighboring states. The 3-mile route through Mill Creek and along the edge of the forest serves both as a remembrance of Margaret and as a fundraiser for organizations that assist families of missing persons. Local artist Rebecca Thompson created a sculpture for the town square that depicts a woman walking toward a forest, her face turned slightly back, as if listening for something behind her. The piece, titled Forever Searching, captures both Margaret's fate and the endless quest for answers that defines so many unsolved cases. As the 40th anniversary of Margaret's disappearance approaches in 2023, the case remains technically active, though investigators acknowledge that significant new developments are unlikely. The forest has kept its ultimate secret well, and time has erased most traces of what happened during those final hours. Yet the story of Margaret Lane continues to resonate because it speaks to universal fears and hopes. Every parent who worries about a child traveling alone, every person who has felt the unease of being followed, every family that has faced the agony of not knowing, they all understand something of what Margaret experienced and what her family has endured. In the end, perhaps the most important legacy of Margaret Lane's disappearance is not the answers it eventually provided, but the questions it continues to ask. How well do we really know the people around us? What secrets might be hiding behind familiar faces? And how do we find the strength to keep searching for truth, even when that truth is buried too deep for any of us to reach? The forest grows thick and green around Mill Creek, its canopy filtering the Georgia sunlight into patterns of shadow and gold. Somewhere beneath those ancient trees, Margaret Lane rests in a place known only to the earth itself. But her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her, in the community that never forgot her, and in the promise that some stories, once told, will never truly end. In the silence of a coney forest, where time moves differently, and secrets grow like moss on forgotten stones, the truth waits patiently, patient as the trees, enduring as the land, eternal as the love that refuses to let the missing be forgotten.